So welcome. My name is Mark Kostin. I'm the Associate Director at the Great Schools Partnership, and I'm privileged to be here to share with some incredible friends and amazing thought partners a very recent report that we have published called Increasing the Racial, Ethnic, and Linguistic Diversity of the Educator Workforce, a call to action for leaders. And so we're privileged to be able to spend some time with you this morning at this Aurora Symposium, talking a little bit about our report and also a little bit about our process, the community we've developed, and the project that's around this. And so we're privileged here to have a number of folks from our task force. There were 40 of us in total. And so we're very fortunate to have both co-chairs with us, Ventura Rodriguez, who is the Senior Associate Commissioner at the Massachusetts Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, Jessica Carolus, who's also the other co-chair of this work. She is a division director at the Vermont Agency of Education. Sam Galloway is the Director of Talent Management, the Bristol Board of Education in Bristol, Connecticut. Apologize for the typo there on my screen, Sam. And Terrell Hill, who just recently, the other day, like 3 days ago, became the superintendent in the Windsor Public Schools district in Connecticut. So we're really glad you're both at the helm and super impressed that on day 3, you're still with us here today for this session, Terrell. So thank you for joining us. What we'd like to do over the course of the next 55 minutes or so is create an opportunity for us collectively to explore the report's framework and talk through a little bit some of the recommendations, mostly engage in a discussion with members of the task force, and to identify some promising practices and next steps, sort of a call to action. We deliberately sort of framed and cast our report as a call to action for leaders, and we very specifically reference not just positional leaders, but dispositional leaders, believing that we all have an opportunity to influence and champion this particular work. In order to do that, we're going to engage in some, in just a short minute, we're going to engage in some community building, which is a very important aspect of the work that we did of our task force. Talk a little bit about the report and then dig into it with a discussion with our task force members. Before I do that, I think it's really important. As I mentioned, there were 40 members of the task force. And so we're fortunate to have 5 of them here today. Obviously, we couldn't fit everybody in, but we wanted to make sure that we recognized as many voices as possible. And this is a short 59-second video clip of one of the task force members, Marianela de la Cruz, who is from the Lawrence Public Schools District in Massachusetts. So let's hear from her very briefly here.
Mark, I just want to let you know, I can't hear her, but I think sometimes when I have my headphones in, it overrides sound coming from the computer.
Sorry, folks. I don't know, Mark. I don't know if it's just me. I can't hear you right now. We seem to. I didn't hear the video, and I can't hear you speaking right now.
I'm having the same experience.
Okay. I'm sure you're saying brilliant things, Mark. Just want to.
Okay, I just switched microphone. Is that better? Okay, I don't know if that's gonna fix the video. I don't want to go back to the video, so apologies for that. Could you hear me before? Like the intro piece?
Before
So
the
was
video, yes.
weird. Okay, of course. So sorry about that. Let me just quickly recap what I was gonna mention is that if you weren't able to hear the video, that was Marianela de la Cruz, who's a program manager at Lawrence Public Schools, talking about the importance of the work and also the importance of the timing of the report. We have a handful of videos of a number of task force members on our webpage. I will make sure to put that in the chat so that you have access to that. So apologies for that. The other thing I was in the process of mentioning is that and just in a to be as transparent and as sort of authentic as possible, I work for the organization that was privileged with supporting the work of this task force, and the bulk of the staff members from our organization that supported this group were all white. And so we recognized very quickly that was something that we needed to make sure that we leaned into, and then we sort of ensured that we were very sort of upfront and thoughtful about what the implications were for that. And so we really wanted to make sure that we built and nurtured a community where all of the perspectives and the experiences, and in particular the stories of our task force members, were part of that process. And so we very deliberately baked into our process, and we met over the course of a year of engaging in community building, and whether that was around constructivist listening dyads, talking about our identities, talking about our experiences, or even as we're going to do here momentarily, talking about the notion of what it means to be a part of the community. We made sure that every single aspect of every single meeting, or every meeting, had an aspect of community building. So if you'll indulge us, we would love to just have you sort of share any thoughts that come to mind for you about this prompt. So please sort of think about a community that particularly significant, or a community that you felt sort of like a strong sense of belonging to and trust with other members. And just sort of say, what are the characteristics that you, from your perspective, made it so, and how did it make you, or how did it make you feel included? So we'll leave this prompt here for another a few seconds, but if you have any sort of thoughts, ideas, perspectives, what rings true for you, please feel free to offer those thoughts for us in the chat. We'd really appreciate that. All right. So let me just talk very briefly, give you a sense of context for this work. So the first thing is that the New England Secondary School Consortium, some of you may be aware, is a formal partnership that includes all 6 state education agencies in our region. We have been working together for 13 plus years now, and under the auspices of improving results for all students and achieving educational equity by strengthening, in particular, secondary education, and attempting and working to close gaps. We had made, as a group, as a governing body for the consortium a couple of years ago, educational equity as a priority, and most recently, the diversification of the educator workforce, and also of scaling pathways as priorities for this most recent year. And so to that effect, we impaneled 2 task forces, one that spent a year on the notion of diversifying the ed workforce, and another that is just about 3 weeks away from releasing a formal report on scaling pathways across the region. We convened our task force, the Diversifying the Educator Workforce Task Force. We began meeting in October of 2019. The pandemic threw things into a little bit of a whirlwind and changed some plans for us as far as meetings, but we ended up having a significant number of virtual meetings over the course of the spring and the summer, and which led to the release of our report in August of 2020. As I mentioned, it was very important for us that our co-chairs of this task force come from state education agencies. And so Ventura and Jess served as our co-chairs and were an integral part of the design and the facilitation of each of our gatherings. As I mentioned, we engaged in community building activities and really trying to make sure that we recognized, honored, surfaced, and included the stories and the perspectives of all of the folks who were on our task force, because it was through those stories and understanding that we solidified and I think really crystallized our work. And I'll just mention very briefly in a second that there are some core ideas to our report, and one piece that's particularly interesting and was very important for us from the get-go is that for this work we wanted to make sure that we establish a series of grounding principles, and I'll run through those in a second. And then finally the establishment of a framework, which is sort of a conceptual overview of our recommendations. And so our report is online. When I stop talking, I'll make sure that I post all of those links for you in the chat. A handful of sections I'll run through the grounding principles in a moment and share the framework, and then we'll hear from our task force members. As I mentioned, the guiding principles were extraordinarily important. This formed the basis probably of the first 2 to 3 of our full day convenings. We really kind of quickly realized and determined that it was extraordinarily important to calibrate our work and to ground our work on some key values and principles. And so for us, those were a deep commitment to equity, a recognition and upfront that we needed to acknowledge the harm that the system has perpetrated and continues to perpetrate. The notion of intersectionality and honoring the identity of everyone in all of its forms was a key piece. We wanted to make sure that everybody's voice was extraordinarily important and did everything to ensure that not only in our process, but also in our casting of our recommendations, that all stakeholder voices and all perspectives are critical. We also were very deeply committed to taking an anti-racist approach, and so we were challenging ourselves to be anti-racist in our work and in our recommendations. And then finally, we believe it's extraordinarily important to regularly and continually measure, share, and reflect on data. And so those were the key principles that we talk a little bit more at the beginning or up front of this report. And then finally, this is in part based on some work that our colleagues at the Connecticut State Department of Education had been doing. We were very sort of captured by the simplicity and the elegance and the systems perspective of the model that they were beginning to use. And that was to sort of think about the phase of an educator's career or the arc of an educator's career from the earliest beginnings of being students themselves in K-12 education and the notion of cultivating their interest, all the way towards entering and successfully completing preparation programs, to the streamlining of certification and the certification processes, next to the recruiting and hiring phase of that work, and finally to the supporting, retaining, and promoting elements. Again, so this piece for us was extraordinarily important and helped really establish both a systems perspective, a coherence perspective, and also followed what we felt was the natural arc or phases of an educator's career. And so all of those components were important. So I'll stop. That's all the piece that I have to share. Now you'll get a chance to hear from the task force members. We have, just to give you a sense of the process, we have a handful of questions. There's 3 questions that we would like to pose and make sure that you hear from each of our task force members. We'll begin with this one. Why did you join the task force? And why was this work important to you? And just by way of maybe sort of organizing this well from a logistics perspective, let's start first with Sam, then go to Jess, Ventura, and then Terrell. This is the way I'm sort of seeing you now, at least on my screen. So Sam, if you can start first. And the first time we hear your voices, folks, if you could just also do an introduction, that would be super helpful as well.
Good afternoon, everyone. Sam Galloway, currently the Director of Talent Management for the Bristol Public Schools, about student population about 8,200, about 650 teachers, 1,300 personnel total. Our diversity numbers here are not outstanding. We are a community that is predominantly white, followed then by Hispanic, and then by Black. However, our teaching force and administrator ranks hover around the 10% area. And it was important for me in my role specifically to be a part of this work, to make change. And, you know, we've been, I will credit our Board of Ed to actually make it a board goal to hire a diverse working staff. So as a Board of Education, they have publicly stated that that is a goal, to make our teaching staff, our custodial staff, like our whole organization, more diverse. And we've been doing a lot of equity work so people understand that diversity doesn't mean a threat to you, right? Because, you know, there's a defensiveness that can come up when you start to talk that language. So it was very important for me to have a seat at the table for my district, for Connecticut in general, and for the work overall.
Super, thanks so much. Now, of course, the images have moved around, but I think Jess, you're next, and then we'll go to Ventura and then Terrell.
Sure. Hi, I'm Jess DeCarolis. I'm Division Director of the Student Pathways Division at the Vermont Agency of Education. My division is responsible for flexible pathways and proficiency in personalized learning, career technical education, adult education, education technology, after-school programs, and remote learning. So it really covers sort of the lifespan of the learning cycle, and has been focused on student-centered learning. As the NESE lead for the Agency of Education for 4 years, I think that joining the task force and being a member of the task force was not only a fait accompli, but felt like a culmination of some work that we'd been engaged in for some time. Personally, I tend to be fairly action-oriented, and this felt like the right fit to engage in collaborative problem solving as a 6-state consortium to really move the needle on some recommendations that have come out of a series of reports in Vermont, beginning as early as 2000, but really ramping up from 2010, in which 2 major obstacles to parity and serving all of our students well really circled around both ensuring that we had an inclusive curriculum and diversifying the educator workforce. And unfortunately, in looking at the passage of legislation, we tended not to move the needle or execute on diversifying the educator workforce. So this task force really provided an opportunity to engage in a collaborative discussion and communicate as a 6-state consortium about the importance of moving the needle.
Awesome, thank you so much, Jess. Ventura?
Yeah, hi, good afternoon. Ventura Rodriguez, Senior Associate Commissioner at the Massachusetts Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. So my work, I oversee a team called the Center for Strategic Initiatives. And, you know, at the end of the day, I mean, we're responsible for educator diversification efforts broadly within Massachusetts. And then we also work to identify and sometimes pilot programs with schools and districts directly that are really targeted at better serving kids that, quite frankly, our Commonwealth isn't serving as well right now. When we look at our data, that's specifically students of color, language learners, special education students, students living in poverty. So we run a variety of programs. So I get to partner with a lot of districts and partners on that. And then also, again, the broader education, educator diversification work. For me, it was important to join the group because you know, we have a lot of work we're doing in Massachusetts, but we also know that we have a lot to learn. And so it was really important for me to be part of a broader collective and learning with my colleagues from throughout New England in terms of the work that they were doing. We hope that we would be able to share some of our initiatives, get feedback on them, but also, like I said, learn about what others are doing. And I think another reason we joined is just the importance of helping to elevate this is an issue, not just in, you know, each of our individual states, but really a regional issue, ultimately a national issue. But we felt like it was important. And I thought that we'd be able to amplify the work in our part of the country if we came together and did the work here as a group. So that's the reasons why I joined.
Great. Oh, go ahead. Sorry, go ahead, Terrell.
Don't worry, you can cut me off after. So,
no, I was just going to say we're okay with time, so we've got about 4 minutes left on this segment. So sorry.
So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. Terrell Hill. I am, as of this past Monday, the interim superintendent for Windsor, Connecticut Public Schools. And why I'm involved in this work is because I believe this work is my life and my passion. So I'm also the president and founder of Black Leaders and Administrators Consortium, Incorporated. And this came out of my dissertation research work. And so while I'm very, very, very committed to diversifying the educator workforce, and I believe I've built my reputation over the last 27 years for that very work, one of the things that I've noticed probably in the last 10 years or so is that we rarely talk about educators of color on the other end of the spectrum, the leadership spectrum. So when I was invited to be a part of this task force, I wanted to make sure that that voice was brought to the table. And I also wanted to make sure that this was not going to be yet another task force. And I remember asking that at my first meeting. I'm like, are we just going to sit here and talk? Because I have no interest to return if that's what we're going to do. I absolutely found out that that was not the case at all. I was very impressed and just amazed at the work that's being done by colleagues across New England. Vermont shook me up, Maine shook me up. I was like, wow, like these folks are really working hard in states that, I admit I was stereotyping. So it was really great to work with colleagues across New England and to see this work being pushed, and it's nice to know that, you're not in something by yourself. I appreciate the efforts of Ventura and the folks in Massachusetts. They included me in some of their earlier efforts around this work. And I just feel like we're all a team and we have work to do. And we're starting here in New England, but I think we all want to see this work move across the country. So that's why I'm involved.
Super. Thank you all. And actually, I think, Terrell, I'm going to start with you this time on this one. And that is, please describe one promising practice that you're either leading or putting in place or deeply familiar with that you feel is a practice that folks should know about. And again, just a little reminder, folks, we'll have some time in the next probably 20, 25 minutes or so for a little while towards the end of our session, have some opportunity to engage in a more kind of open discussion. So please feel free, if questions come up for you, please feel free to type them in the chat, but we'll also open up all the microphones as well. So Terrell, a promising practice that you would like to share with us.
So thank you. So one of the practices that I found to be pretty reliable and successful, and over the last 6 years that I've spent in human resources, is I haven't had a real hard time recruiting folks of color to the district. We actually had just this September, I reported out, we are just under 21%, and that's a little less than 10% increase in the 6 years that I've been in this role. So I'm very proud of that fact. But also what I realized, again, as I said in my last statement with your first question, this is a team effort. It's not about just Windsor by itself. Just because Windsor can move numbers doesn't make us look good. We're here in Connecticut, so that's where I've started, and I've developed the practice and the habit of reaching out to other districts. So Sam and I are pretty close. We're in the same organization. We talk regularly. So if I don't have something, I have started the practice of calling Sam, calling others in HR and talent offices and saying, hey, I have this incredible young Latina. I don't have a position. She, just fell into my lap, her resume, someone knew me, and do you have a position for her? So not just looking to advocate for my own district, but looking to advocate for our state. And now being a part of this group for New England. So I now know, I can continue that practice and expand it by calling out to others saying, hey, do you guys have something? Because what happens, and a lot of people don't talk about it, you have a large number of educated and certified, folks of color, but if they don't get a position somewhere, or they tend to believe they only fit in an inner city or urban environment, they just move away from our profession. but advocating for them, even if you can't bring them in your district, but advocating for them somewhere else, I think is a promising practice, and I've seen it work.
Awesome, great, thank you. Let's go next to, so let's do Ventura next, if you don't mind, and then Sam, and then Jess. So same question for you, Ventura. Share, describe a promising practice that you're implementing or that you have experience with seeing that it's working, that is working well.
Yeah, well, one promising practice, and you know, this is Dr. Hill mentioned that, you know, we asked him to help us a few years ago as we were pulling stakeholders to design this program, is we run something called Influence 100. And, you know, that program is really charged with helping us to diversify our superintendent ranks in Massachusetts. And so as we've been doing work around, you know, diversifying the teacher workforce, I think what became clear very quickly is that if we don't have senior leaders in positions now like Dr. Hill is in, that can prioritize this work, that can really center the importance of racial equity, not only in hiring, but in everything that we do in districts, how we spend our money, sort of how we think about teaching and learning. Like, without the leadership to really center that work, it felt like, you know, we're going to continue to add teachers, and then teachers will leave oftentimes at higher rates than people who aren't, or teachers who aren't people of color. So this program, what it does is it's a 4-year pilot. We're in year 2 right now. And each year we identify about 25 individuals who become fellows in the program. These are current, usually principals, they're district level leaders. We have 6 assistant superintendents. We put them through a 2-year fellowship that includes monthly programming that we provide in partnership with a group called the Leadership Academy. And then in addition to that monthly programming that's focused on the skills of being a superintendent, I mean, it really centers how to lead with a racial equity lens. And it really taps into people's identities and how you use that and how that factors into your leadership as a district leader. What we also do is partner with our state school superintendent and school committee associations to be able to make sure that we're giving access to these fellows to the places and the people that actually do the hiring, because it's not the job post that gets you a job. Oftentimes you need the relationship with the hiring manager and, you know, the search firm. And so we're building those relationships. A final component of that program, which is actually work we need to expand, is that in order to participate, we needed buy-in from the sending school committees or the school committee itself. And so if we have a fellow from a district, we needed the school committee to sign on to the application, because the current superintendent and school committee members have access to 4 quarterly sessions that are really aimed at helping those groups think about their own role in supporting things like racial equity and supporting superintendents in their district. One of the things we're trying to flesh out here is how do we provide even further support to our school committees? And we have a call this afternoon where we're specifically partnering with the School Committee Association to figure out what other support can we provide, do we need to provide to our school committees as part of this work.
Awesome, thank you, Ventura. And Sam, promising practice or 2.
Thank you. So I'll go with the N, more than 1, right? I'll first say the promising practice, I didn't realize it at the time, was to have the board publicly state it as a goal, right? So that's going to drive a lot of the work. So even for administrators who don't quite get it, I just point to the board's mission, right? This is aligned, so you must conform. And Ventura, you mentioned something very important that I wasn't going to mention, but it's key. Unless we reach the hiring managers, i.e., right, the principals who are forming the committees and selecting the applicant pool, unless they get it, then people will be dismissed, right? So that needs to happen. Now, for Bristol specifically, my response is to exploit multiple avenues. And what I mean by that is we have a partnership with CREC, a regional agency here, and we have teacher candidates going through a shortened certification process. So kind of homegrown. So we're supporting them. We're actually paying them while they're learning to be teachers. So we've taken on that financial responsibility on their behalf. You know, one guy's a double hit. He's a person of color and he's a veteran. So, you know, that crosses into another program I'll talk about, Troops to Teachers, and Terrell is a main driver in that as well, where we talk about diversification of our workforce, but we want veterans as well. And you know, Terrell's a veteran, and Connecticut is a small state, right? It's like you make a few phone calls, right? So relationships matter. And we've also partnered with the Relay program, and it is set up specifically for para-educators to become certified to teach, which is helpful when you're trying to grow your own. So in Bristol, it's not quite like Windsor. Windsor is more centrally located. Bristol's like off the grid a little bit, and trying to get people of color to actually come here. It's where ESPN, their home is. And that's all people know. And they're like, why would I want to come to Bristol when I can go to Windsor, Hartford, Bloomfield, or other communities? So that's always a tough sell. But when people either work here or live here and understand how to move about and feel comfortable in the community, and they're people of color, that's a win if you can grow them up. And most recently, in relation to my initial comment, why relationships matter, one of our former colleagues, Dr. Shawana Tucker, is now at the State Department of Ed, and we were all working together. So Terrell knows her, she knows me, and she contacted me, and I believe she's contacted Terrell. We've established a relationship with Central Connecticut State University to bring in teachers of color who are currently in the ed program to start working in our district. So these are like juniors and seniors. And I talked to the principals already, say, hey, these people are gonna come to your school. You're gonna pair them up with the right mentor teacher, and we're gonna grow them. We're gonna show them how fabulous it is to be a teacher in Bristol, and we're gonna pay them as subs. So we're gonna teach them, but then they're also gonna work with us, and hopefully we can recruit these folks.
Super. Thank you, Sam. And Jess, a promising practice you're either involved in or supporting or aware of.
Sure. I think I might just riff off of the relationships matter theme that's really surfacing. And I think one of the promising practices that we're attempting to put in place now is to grow our Vermont task force team to strengthen those relationships and actually bring some coherence to some activities, which will be culminating in a 3-part webinar series we're offering beginning in November. That's time before the hiring and budget season, so that we can support leaders in actually engaging in a process that's just in time and thinking about preparing for fiscal year 22. So in expanding the task force, we really reached out to the various stakeholders who would occupy the different sectors that we identified for courageous leaders. So making sure that we had representation at the state level, but also representation across our membership organizations like our Principals Association, our Superintendents Association, our School Boards Association, our Special Educators Association, and Curriculum Association, as well as having classroom educators and community leaders from across different sectors. So around equitable policing practices to our library associations, to bring folks together to stand behind this report and animate the report, and then zero in on the recruiting and hiring practices so that are, particularly as I think many states are experiencing right now, is we have an opportunity to sort of leverage not only this report, but also leverage the reality that COVID has sort of placed on us, that has really identified how existing and pernicious inequities have really been exacerbated because of COVID-19.
All right, thank you. So we're going to go to our last question, and thank you to Pam for sharing the note about the program that you're involved in, the Journey into Teaching and Journey into Education and Teaching program with the link. Appreciate that. So please feel free to share thoughts, resources, and then also just a reminder after this question, we want to kind of really open it up and hear from you and what sort of thoughts, questions would you like to add to this conversation. So the third question I have for each of you, please, and maybe we can start Terrell and then Sam and then Jess and Ventura. I need to make sure that Terrell, Sam, Jess, and Ventura, what's one high leverage practice or approach that is either emerging or sort of percolating that's not yet fully implemented that when you feel would be put in place will help move the needle? So maybe something you have an eye on or something you really wish you'd be able to sort of implement because you really feel it's going to begin to make a difference for us. So again, we'll start with Terrell and then go to Sam.
So thank you for this question, Mark. I was anticipating a question like this, and I'm glad it came up so quickly. I would say the organization that I started, Black Leaders and Administrators Consortium, which, just real quickly is an organization that was designed to bring Black leaders. Of course, we have other members, people who can join, we don't discriminate, but I realized in my research that we needed an organization for Black leaders that would bring them together and help advocate for their career progression at the highest levels. As I said, I give a shout out to Ventura and Massachusetts for allowing me to be a part of their development of their Influence 100 program. But I think like programs like that, so Black here in Connecticut starting out, I want to see it go nationwide. As it gains more notoriety and connections, we already are an official partner of the state of Connecticut. When you get these leaders of color in these senior positions, which we've heard repeatedly now, then some of this stuff will be mitigated. I'm not saying it guarantees everything, and I'm not saying that white leaders currently don't hire folks of color. But when people are being brought to our profession, I use this analogy. I majored in business in undergrad. And when I was being courted to take on corporate positions, they didn't take me to customer service and say, one day you too can be here and get a softer chair. They always took me to, one of the vice presidents or some senior exec and show that corner office and, the nice view or something that you could aspire to. I think in education, we do a very poor job of that. Teaching is our entry-level position, and it doesn't mean you're a bad person if you say, this is what I want to do for my career, right? That's how most things happen in our society. But we don't show folks of color the opportunities. We don't make our profession sexy, for lack of a better term. What are the things they can aspire to? So with our organization, what we intend to do as a collective of leaders, not only have our leaders being well-trained and prepared to take on all these various leadership roles at higher levels across the district in traditionally non-urban or districts that don't have high populations of color. We're just starting to break into predominantly white districts. The relationships that we're building and the trust that's being built with Black in these districts, I'm loving it because you have districts that in a few hundred years of existence have never hired a person of color or never hired a person of color in their leadership roles. So that's starting to happen. So I think what we're doing is extremely important. And I don't want to take all of it because Sam is actually my vice president. So I'm sure he probably has other take on it and other angles and other things. But I'll just say what we're doing with Black Leaders and Administrators Consortium, I think is definitely a promising practice.
Great, thanks, Terrell. Sam?
I'll just continue with that because, as a representative of my specific district, I will have to step out of that role and really promote the initiative through Black. And my response to the question would be to approach boards of ed to say, make this part of one of your stated goals. And, in the year 2020, to have communities still like to never have hired a person of color is to me shocking. Like to where you have to provide like this justification as to why it's valuable. But if it's where we are, it's where we are, right? Even making that a stated public goal could cause conversation. But I think, one that's not is I think every district should have that as a goal. Stop talking about it, put it in writing, and then it is aligned with the work of the district.
Great, Thank you, Sam. Jess?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, and particularly this idea of stop talking about it. I think we had a lot of discussions in our task force about the opportunities of both dispositional and positional leadership. I think colloquially, I would call that don't ask or wait for permission. And I think a great example of that and a high leverage practice that I'm looking forward to us implementing is once the report was released and our governor read it, he made the connection to connect the work of the agency and the task force with our Agency of Commerce and Community Development, and particularly two programs that they're running, the remote worker program and the worker relocation programs, which are both incentive programs, grant programs, which we know as a practice, the idea of, not only putting, putting things into practice, but putting your money where your mouth is. And so that's work that we're going to be engaging in this year, which I'm really excited about, and really feels like we've moved the needle. And really that came out of moving forward with this task force without necessarily waiting for permission.
Great, thank you, Jess. And Ventura, last word on this question.
Sure, and again, I agree with what's already been said. I mean, on the practicality of, you're not going to even be able to measure, if you don't set it as a goal and dedicate resources to it. So the couple of things I would say are maybe rooted in what we've identified as barriers or what we've heard as barriers for people of color to either enter the profession or remain in the profession. I think one thing I would say is we have a state, licensing exam. We call it the MTEL, which many states have. One of the things that we're piloting, we just got permission from our state board to do it, is in essence, we're trying to pilot, in addition to the sort of paper test that you sort of sit and take, we're trying to pilot statewide some just additional ways to measure like content knowledge and like some of the skills that are required to be an educator. Now, let me be clear, because when I bring this up, people are always like, wait, so you guys are lowering standards? I never said that. That is not what we're doing. Be very clear. We think it's critical for teachers to have content knowledge, strong content knowledge, and there's some basic skill requirements that everyone should have in the profession. So that's what I'm saying. However, we think that there may be additional ways to assess that that we need to look at. So we have a pilot that our board just approved that we're, again, starting to implement, and we'll be implementing shortly, which is essentially working with some of like our educator preparation programs to have them help us attest to things like the content knowledge of their candidates in a way that could be in addition to the more traditional format of like the paper and pencil test that our candidates take. So that's one very concrete. I think the other, if I could just be as sneak in a second one here, Mark, is that we oftentimes hear of sort of the financial barrier and what feels like a financial sacrifice oftentimes for like people of color who are sometimes like first in their families to go to college, and they're getting actually pressure from their families to like go into some other job that makes more money because oftentimes they're supporting other people, And so I think if we don't address like in a concrete way that financial piece, and so one idea of, yes, we can try to pay more and that's a path to take. But I think another is to try to offer real benefits like on the front end, like covering 4-year college costs that has a real tangible dollar value that we can point to and say, hey, look, you enter the profession, you get an $80,000 benefit by not having college debt, and then you work for 4 years, and you can really, by that point, we'll get them hooked. So I'm not worried about that. But it's just a matter of like, you have to put a real financial incentive to remove what are real barriers. And I think oftentimes those barriers are on the front end for people even going into and completing a 4-year degree, completing an ed prep program. So that's something that we're trying to explore here in Massachusetts, to try to address some of those financial barriers up front.
Thanks, Ventura. And actually, that if I can sort of utilize my facilitator prerogative to interject an idea or two here, and then I know Terrell, I want to go back to you because there's an additional thought you want to add here. What Ventura just sort of highlighted to me was one of the greatest benefits of engaging in this work as a 6-state collaborative, because it provided us with increased opportunities for sharing and connecting. And so the strategies that Ventura just described would not necessarily have been surfaced or shared in that particular way at this particular time, had we not had the benefit of the 6-state collaborative sort of helping to coordinate and lift up this particular work. And then a piece that Jess mentioned is, when she sort of slipped in that, when the governor read the report, I mean, that's the other thing that's really critical about this, is that we know this work is extraordinarily important, and we're sort of privileged and honored that through the relationship with the 6-state education agencies, we know that we have champions at all levels in every state, including division directors, commissioners, and governors who've been sort of championing this effort. So kind of an illustration of the systemic nature of this work. And then finally, I'll just say maybe just a couple of other words, like a strategy that for me that came up that teachers talked a lot about in our group was just the notion of establishing and supporting racial affinity groups. And I know there's a program that's statewide in Massachusetts. There's a handful of districts that provide this, but just the power and the recognition and the notion that of supporting educators of color in districts, or diverse educators in districts by supporting creating either time or reimbursing for food or meals, or just sort of acknowledging and supporting the idea of a racial affinity group goes an extraordinarily long way. We heard from many of the members of our task force. So those are a couple of pieces that I would interject. And I know, Terrell, I think you've got one more thought before we open it up for some broader questions.
Thank you, Mark. And it's actually, that was like a perfect connection to what you just said, right? So I also wanted to lift up CALAS, which is the Connecticut Association of Latino Administrators and Superintendents, and our colleague who was on the task force, Madeline Negrone, with the Dr. Madeline Negrone, who's at Hartford Public Schools. So she was the president at the time. They just selected a new president, but we, Black and CALAS, are starting to build that bond and relationship. And, Mark was just talking about these racial affinity groups, because we are not at odds. We are working together to ensure that, African-American and Latino administrators are getting the opportunities or greater opportunities that they haven't been getting. So this work has been, again, the relationship we have with the State Department of Education. The commissioner, Dr. Miguel Cardona, is a member of CALAS, and he's been very clear that Black and CALAS have been working very closely together, and we're continuing to build that bond because it's important. And many times, leaders of color, it's already isolating as a leader in general. Anyone that's in leadership knows that. But you're a leader of color, you really feel like you're out on some island. And so we are trying to mitigate that factor. And again, we're pushing for each other to continue to move. Thank you, Mark.
Great, yeah, thanks. And then just a note to another comment that Pam has posted in the chat about a state grant in the state of Massachusetts that supports with funding the paraprofessionals who are pursuing a bachelor's degree to go into teaching. And that's actually, it's unfortunate that you didn't hear Marianella at the beginning. She was the video in her introduction. One of the amazing and remarkable programs that she and her colleagues run is a training program, if I'm not mistaken, for residents and parents and community members in Lawrence to become paraprofessionals. And so it's sort of like a thinking about sort of like the pipeline that for them is an extraordinarily, it just helps in so many ways, but sort of this notion of homegrown networking, connections, bringing folks together, providing on-the-job training, an entry into the profession, especially in a number of different communities, extraordinarily powerful and promising. And so what I'd love to do is just, we've got another 10 minutes here before we need to wrap up. If folks have any, didn't necessarily see any questions in the chat, but please feel free to type them in, or just unmute yourself and ask away. We're a small group here. We want to make this as informal as possible, and we really appreciate the time you've been spending with us. So what kind of questions are coming up for you, or thoughts that you'd like to ask or hear from our panelists?